Educator's Lens. Today, I am so honored to welcome Elena Aguilar, a writer, leader, teacher, coach, and podcaster whose work has deeply shaped how we understand resilience, coaching, and equity in education. Elena is the author of 8 highly acclaimed books, including The Art of Coaching, Onward, Cultivating Emotional Resilience in Educators, and Coaching for Equity. Her newest book, Arise, The Art of Transformational Coaching, continues to expand her impact on the field. She is also the founder and CEO of Bright Morning Consulting, an organization dedicated to helping individuals and systems create the conditions for meaningful transformation. Through her work, Elena has taught tens of thousands of educators how to engage in conversations that build more than a just and equitable world. You can also hear her in action on the Bright Morning podcast, where she models these powerful conversations. Elena, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Robin.
To start us off, you've written extensively about resilience in education. How has your understanding of resilience evolved over time, especially in the context of today's schools?
That's a great question because my book Onward, which is about resilience, was written in 2016, 2017. So 10 years ago, I was working on it. And in some ways, the world is a very different place now, particularly because we went through a global pandemic. And for many of us in many countries in the world, we're just living through really tumultuous times with a lot of change and a lot of instability and insecurity. And so, in some ways, things are different now, and in some ways, they're the same. One of the shifts in my thinking about resilience, maybe I wouldn't say it's a shift, it's just a deepening of an understanding and a different element, or one of the elements of how we cultivate resilience that I am emphasizing more, is the role of the need for people to individually really have space and time to look at their own mental health, their mental well-being, their psyches, their histories, their childhoods. And so since that book, I'm going to just jump in a little bit more personally here. Since Onward was published, I have learned so much about myself through therapy. So that book was published. Not long after that, my son started going to high school. He was traveling on public transportation quite a bit every day. And I started noticing my own anxiety just going up and up and up. And I finally realized, like, I have more anxiety than many others, than my husband, and I really need to do something about it, a little bit more than what I had previously done. I had been in therapy on and off when I was younger, and I was like, but I always felt like I couldn't find a therapist that I really liked. So I really committed, and I went and I found a great therapist, and I found therapeutic modalities that really supported me. And in that process, I really came to understand, what was it that I could do that was sort of cultivating resilience on a daily basis, all the things that I write about in Onward. And what was it that needed to be sort of a deep clearing and a cleaning and excavation of old stuff and like childhood trauma and chronic stress that really deserved some deep attention. And so that's something, and I write about that in Arise a little bit more, but that's something that has changed for me in the last 10 years. Is like, yeah, there's a lot of daily practices we can do, like the ones I write about in Onward. And sometimes it's kind of like how your house probably needs to be cleaned every week or two, and you can do the counters and the dishes and the floors. And then every couple of years or every year, you need to do a deep cleaning and go into the garage and get out all the boxes and sort through stuff you no longer need. And that's kind of the analogy that I think is is relevant for me when talking about resilience. We can do regular ongoing practices, and then we also need and deserve to do some of the deep cleaning. And given that probably at least 2/3 of the people in the world are living with some level of trauma. Trauma doesn't have to be the big stuff. It doesn't have to be the catastrophic divorce or the war or whatever. Um, we really need and deserve to look at ourselves closely and have space and time to process that content. So that's, I would say, one of the big shifts is just an appreciation awareness for what can happen, what needs to happen individually.
I know you mentioned cleaning out the boxes of your house. That made me think of, I don't know if you've seen Marie Kondo, The Joy of Cleaning.
Yes.
But yeah, that concept where you sometimes need to take out all of the clothes and make a big pile and then really sort through. But what really needs to give then when you have to stop and drudge all that up? Was that kind of a time where other things needed to fade into the background for you?
That's a good question. There was a period when, okay, wow. I'm just going to say it. I'm just going to share a little, yeah, I'll share about my process. So I spent many, many years repressing and suppressing difficult emotions and working really, really hard and writing lots of books and doing all of this. And then there came this period where I didn't want to anymore. I could have continued doing that, but I didn't want to. And as I started processing my life, my decisions, my childhood, and so on, I did realize there was a period of time, about a year, where I stepped away from work a little bit. I mean, it was like a couple days a month. Or when I started having therapy on Wednesday afternoons, and I would tell my teammates, like, don't schedule anything for me then because I have therapy. And often after I have therapy, I just need to go for a walk. I need to process. Like, I can't go straight back into work. And that was, in some ways, it was hard for me to do that and to say that. And in other ways, it wasn't. And what happened so quickly was, basically, I kind of started feeling better in so many ways so quickly. And people would recognize that who didn't know that I started doing a lot of therapy. I was like, I do things really intensely. And when I find something that works, and I finally found a modality that worked, then I do it intensely and I'm all in. And I was like, wow. And then people who didn't know I was doing this would say, you seem so different. You seem lighter. You seem happier. You seem more comfortable. And I was like, yeah. And so that allowed me to give myself more permission to kind of galvanize that. And so the irony, I mean, it's not irony, but it's made me so much better as a teacher, coach, writer, presenter, because as I've sorted through a lot of stuff, I'm just able to be myself and be comfortable and have more boundaries and feel more joy in my work and more proud of what I do. So it's really had a profound catalytic effect on my life.
Listeners, if you can tell, this is the reason why I love Elena's work, and it's because it's all centered around her own personal identity too, and it's all intertwined. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm curious, what aspects of identity do you find educators also struggled most to examine or even name, and why do you think that might be?
Mm. So when I think about the aspects of our identity, I'm thinking about our socio-political construct of our identity. So I'm thinking about gender, race, ethnicity, age, generation, languages spoken at home, immigration status, socioeconomic status of childhood, all those things. And those shape our lives and our relationships so profoundly. I think one of the reasons that we don't recognize or investigate some of those, in part, is because we don't know how, because some folks live in communities or societies in which there isn't a value necessarily seen in doing that kind of reflection and exploration. And depending on where we live and who we're around, there can be more acceptance or discomfort with those kinds of explorations. And so for many people, looking at our race or ethnicity can be uncomfortable, can be hard because we have to contend with a whole history and privilege and power, and that can feel challenging and complicated. Um, Looking at sexual orientation can be uncomfortable for folks. Gender identification. It in some ways it really depends a little bit on where we live and who we're around, and whether there are other people that we're around who are having these conversations. Um, but it's what happens is that reflection or those conversations might bring up discomfort or conflict or tension within ourselves or with others. And many of us don't know how to deal with conflict or tension or discomfort. So that's really the root cause. It's not the issue with the identity awareness or conversations. The issue is, ooh, we don't know what to do when things feel tense with other people or there's conflict. So, yeah.
Yeah, you hit on a point there. That's something that we've spoken about with my colleagues is sometimes when you're trying to help somebody, you might want to fix it for them because you might have that quick answer or that quick resource or that quick step in for them. And for us, it sometimes feels uncomfortable to sit back and perhaps ask those questions that would get them to draw out some of their own beliefs and ways of being. And do you think there's a balance where that lies between being able to do that for somebody or just being okay with holding space as they feel those discomforts?
Well, there's the question really is, what do they need and what would be helpful? And there is a time and a place where, as coaches, as leaders, it's appropriate to offer suggestions. There's a time and a place where it's appropriate to offer resources. And the problem is that we either overestimate the degree to which that could be helpful, like we do that way too much, or
Mhm.
we just don't hold off long enough to listen for what the person needs. And so many coaches, many leaders have this sort of fix it inclination, this tendency. Part of that comes from ourselves. So let's say me as a coach, and I see someone, I think, ooh, I'm going to make this suggestion. Some of that comes from me wanting to feel successful and effective. Like, ooh, if I give them that resource, I will have done a good job. They will feel better and I can go home and rest. And that's sort of like, I want to feel good at my job. I want to feel like I did something. And so sometimes we jump into taking action or the sort of fix it approach. Sometimes I do that when I am someone else is distressed, they're upset, and I'm uncomfortable with them being upset. Really, it's I'm uncomfortable with their distress, and I think, ooh, I can try this and they'll feel better. So it's really me being uncomfortable, me not being able to be with a moment of uncertainty. We are also very conditioned or socialized into the fix it mindset. Like, that's what my job is as a coach, as a school leader. I got to fix problems. I got to make, that's, we've been kind of indoctrinated into this belief. So, what I'm suggesting is a big shift in saying, in part, slow down enough to either find out what the root cause of the problem is or help let someone else figure out the answer to their problem. Trust that the other person can figure out the answer to their problem. So, when I was a new coach, I it's kind of sometimes I feel a little embarrassed thinking back, but I was probably sort of a fix it coach 90% of the time, 95% of the time. I would go in and observe a teacher and I thought, I know exactly what they need. And most of the time I was wrong. And I just didn't wait long enough to hear what they were really experiencing. I sort of didn't trust that they could know what they needed. I wanted to be doing a good job. I wanted to think, yeah, I do know what and sometimes like when I waited long enough and then I would hear, oh, they do just need a resource. They need a recommendation for a good novel for their grade 6 students to read, or that it was like sometimes there was helpful for me to make suggestions or give a resource, but a lot of times I offered it too soon. And a lot of times I was off in what they really needed.
So a good strategy might be to just wait if you can a little bit, and the answer might come to them before you have to interject.
Yes. One of my favorite coaching sentence stems is tell me more. And so imagine you are talking to a teacher and they spend 3 or 4 minutes describing a difficult situation, something they're frustrated about. Follow up with something like, that sounds really hard. Tell me more. And let them talk for another 3 or 4 minutes. And then you can follow up with, what kind of support would you like from me? How can I be helpful? And let them see if they can identify. Sometimes people will say things like, oh, I just really needed to get that off my chest. I just really needed to like talk and have you listen. Or sometimes a teacher will follow up saying, well, I mean, now that I think about it, I probably could do this, or maybe I could do that. And sometimes they'll follow up and say, I don't know what to do. Do you have any suggestions? So just wait, give them a chance to talk, ask them what would be helpful. But even when they say, I don't know, do you have any suggestions? I would say hold off just a little bit longer, because I trust that actually people do have ideas. So if a teacher says that to me, I might say something like, I am willing to give you some suggestions. I can definitely do that. But let me ask you just one more question first. And then I might say something like, has there ever been a time in the past where you've been dealing with something like this? And what worked then? Or I might say, yeah, I can give you some suggestions, but I'm just really curious first, like, what are a few of the ideas that you've thought about maybe trying? Because I want the answers to come from them as much as possible. And yes, there comes a time when they'll say, I don't know. I've tried everything. And then I might say, okay, I've got a few ideas, but I want to know what you think of these ideas. I really want you to give me your feedback. And they'll say, but here are my ideas. But a lot of times we want to give people more space first to find the answers to their questions, because they can, because they will.
I really, really appreciate that response, especially given the time where we have access to systems that try to almost make everything like as if it could be robotic, coaching systems where you could walk in and you should be able to identify right away whether the children are walking in appropriately according to your system. But your work is humanized and also empowering and allows educators to come from a place that reaffirms their professional identities and their ability to harness the strength from within themselves. So thank you for sharing that voice at this time.
You're welcome.
I'm curious, from your perspective, what is the most urgent skill or mindset school leaders need to cultivate right now to build resilience in their school communities?
Mm, that's a really good question. And I have so many answers, but it starts with school leaders need to build their own resilience. And so the skill they need to build is about how to cultivate their own resilience. They need to put on the oxygen mask first. They need to know for themselves what works to build resilience. And so, really, it starts with having a healthy relationship with their emotions, with knowing their emotions, recognizing when emotions arise, knowing how to relate to those emotions, because that's what they're going to need to coach others on or model for others. A school leader is really the most important person in the building in terms of setting the standard, the emotional standard, and people orient towards that school leader in terms of how do we behave? How do we show up? How do we deal with conflict? How do we appreciate each other? How do we give feedback? And so the school leader, it's a hard role because the school leader is on all the time and is being observed all the time and needs to model these skills. And so they cannot foster resilience in others unless they are simultaneously doing it within themselves. It's just they don't know what it's like to do. They won't be seen as models, as walking the path with them. So I would really start there because all of the other things that happen in schools that need to be attended to, like being able to give teachers really good feedback so that they can improve their teaching, or dealing with conflict within a team, or making decisions through the whole school. All of that has at its core how we relate to each other, how we relate to emotions. It's social emotional intelligence. And a school leader needs to be skilled a as somebody navigating emotions.
You mentioned before there are some great sentence stems that we can use when we're working one-on-one with educators. Do you have any favorite sentence stems for administrators when they're working with colleagues or with teachers during their practice?
They would definitely be the same. I think about school leaders as being able to take a coaching stance when they are working with teachers they support or colleagues. They may not be a coach because they are a school leader, and usually that is a different role and more expansive and has some evaluatory elements to it, but they can take a coaching stance. And so if they are trying to help someone to grow, to improve, if they are in that taking that kind of a stance with someone, then they can use the same tell me more. What might be helpful? What ideas do you have? How have you tried this in the past? And for a teacher, experiencing that with a school leader is really powerful because that leader is communicating a message that I trust that you can find answers. I don't need to be the expert here. You know your children way better than I do. You know what's happening in your classroom. I trust you. And that's really meaningful to have that kind of message from an administrator, from a site leader.
That would be beautiful to imagine that as the site leader and then your support coming in also with the same message. And then I would imagine the teachers would then trickle down to the students, and then the students would also be experiencing those types of conversations where they're asked and they're empowered by their own thinking and how they might like to learn in their own classrooms too.
Yes, definitely.
There's often a tension between supporting individual resilience and addressing systemic challenges. So I'm curious, how can educators both hold caring for themselves while also pushing for meaningful change?
Well, the more energy we have as individuals, the more reserves we have in our resilience tank, the more grounded and resourced we feel like we have, the more energy we have available to make system change. And so I don't think it has to be one or the other. It's important to have an awareness of what is within our sphere of influence and our sphere of control. But when we are depleted, which is what happens when we have very little resilience, when we're depleted and we're exhausted and we're feeling despairing and hopeless. We tend to not use our energy where it's most impactful. We tend to not have the energy to have the kinds of conversations that could lead to real change. And so it's tricky because we have to start with ourselves. We have to build our own resilience. And we are so interconnected, and the systems that we live within impact us so much. And so we simultaneously also want to be or need to be working to address the systems and the structures and the institutions that we work in. But you can't pour from an empty cup. You can't give, you can't address those larger macro systems when you're depleted.
So, in your work, how do you help educators then distinguish between what they can influence internally and what they might be able to challenge externally?
Mhm. That's always a meaningful conversation. Sometimes one of the elements that comes into the conversation is an educator's core values. And so I write about and guide people in identifying their core values and then in identifying the places where they can enact those values, the places where those values are undermined. And so there's some decision making about what it, again, the key question is, where do I want to use my energy? I
Mm.
have limited amount of energy. Where do I want to use it? And so let's say you might be able to influence the reading program that your school adopts, or you might be able to influence the selection of a new administrator or the salaries for teachers, or and it's just a choice. What do you want? Where do you want to put your energy? Or do you want to really stay with just what is within your classroom and think about, how do I focus on influencing my students who are multilingual learners? And that's what I really want to influence this next year, is supporting my students to acquire more English skills. Or it's a decision that's personal to each teacher, each person, that people deserve to have some space to think through and to be guided through making that decision.
I love that idea of selecting one focus area and selecting what you can influence, because that puts your ray of light into one beautiful area. And that's not the idea, not being that you won't be able to use that in the future, but that you can then shine into a different place and then you'll have gained that skill. So maybe your light will be a bit bigger and brighter in time.
Right. Yes. It's just focus. Yeah. Hmm.
You shine that light. I love that. For an educator listening right now who might be feeling exhausted or discouraged, it is May here. Also May where you are. Same planet. Do you have some entry points for building resilience that might get them through to the end of the year that might feel realistic and meaningful as well?
Hmm. Well, I think I would first say that if there are educators listening who are feeling exhausted, depleted, who are just struggling to get to the end of the year, counting down the days, I think the first thing I would say is, you're not alone. And these are really hard times to be an educator. And you deserve space and time to process this experience and what has brought you to feeling so challenged right now. And I would say there are things that you could do if they sound like they would feel good. Because sometimes I think when we're really depleted and someone says, like, well, you could try this, and you could try this, you could try this, it can feel like, oh, no, nothing is going to help. Don't give me any more suggestions.
Yeah.
And so I will offer some suggestions, but I'll also say if you hear them and feel like, no, then let them all go. And I trust that you know how to get through this time. And then I hope that there's some space for you to think about what could be different for you next year. One of the practices to build resilience that I find really helpful, especially when I'm really struggling, is the practice of noticing bright spots. And so a bright spot is anything that feels good, brings you joy, feels nice. And the thing is, we actually experience dozens or even hundreds of those every day, little tiny things, little bright spots, but we often don't notice them. And that could be something like walking out of the house in the morning and feeling that first sort of hit of fresh air and feeling like, oh, it's really springtime and everything feels alive and it smells good. So that little moment could be a bright spot. And a lot of times we're rushing to get to the car, to get to school, and we don't notice. So there's a couple of parts to make this practice really meaningful. The first thing is notice the bright spot. The second is savor the bright spot. And this can literally be 60 to 90 seconds. And savoring is taking in the experience through all of your senses: sight, smell, sound, feeling, all of it. And so, for example, maybe a bright spot is that you get to school and a student who you haven't seen in a while says, like, hi, teacher. Something like, imagine a young child, just like, hi, teacher. And and you feel like, oh, that little moment, and then stop and take in where you're at, what that feels like, what you're seeing, all of it. That practice really does help us and build resilience. And there's a lot of science behind everything I suggest, and it's included in some of my books. But what is happening in the brain and in the body, if you can do 60 to 90 seconds of taking that in, is really powerful. And if you can do that a few times a day, it's really powerful. Okay, so then there's a third part, which I'm just going to mention, which is like you get exponential resilience by doing this third part, which is sharing it with someone. And so if there are, let's say, a group of friends, teachers, grade level, a department, a school that uses this as a common practice, when you share, whether that is verbally or in a text message or whatever, you share your bright spot, that is another level of deepening the experience and the resilience that you can gain. And so I don't know, that's one of my favorite practices. I would say it's an easy one to do. You can do it at all these different levels that can really help you through some difficult days. Like when I'm having difficult days, I will tell myself, like, okay, Elena, you have a job today. You're going to find 3 bright spots. And sometimes I'm like, okay, that was easy. My cat came and sat on my lap and he purred and he's really sweet and warm. And then I drank my cup of tea and it was just delicious and tasty. And I love my cup. The things that you often don't notice. That's the thing. It brings us into like, oh, this feels good. This moment. When things are really hard, it's critical.
That's a beautiful one. I think that is simple and easy, which are usually the best techniques to use because you don't require anything to do it other than what you already show up with every day, and then adding that little connection piece with somebody else. You get to hear their bright spot, and you might start noticing what other people notice too, as bright spots become your bright spots too.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. To close us out, if we imagined resilience as not just pushing through, but as something more collective, more humane, and more just, if you could close your Elena eyes and tell us what a school might look like and feel like for you, what would that be?
Hmm. Oh, it would feel so good to walk into. I think you'd walk in and you would just feel like, ooh, something is different in this school. I think you would see and hear a lot of real laughter amongst adults. You'd hear people um, laughing. You would also hear people giving each other feedback and maybe challenging feedback and saying something like, "Hey, I noticed the way that you interacted with that student. And in that moment, it didn't feel like it represents how we want to be treating students. I'm curious what you noticed about what was going on in that moment for yourself." So we'd hear people naming the moments when they weren't living into who they want to be or who they had agreed to be or the school's values or its mission. I think you would see conflict, healthy conflict. Healthy conflict is a sign of a healthy school culture. It's a sign of a community that has built resilience. And so that might sound like, Robin, I want to push back on something you said in our last team meeting. And I want to name that. And maybe there'd even be an element in which someone's identity would be included. And so, kind of coming back to that question about that you asked about identity markers and experience, a healthy school community that has built resilience would be able to have conversations about race and ethnicity and gender and privilege and power. And they might be uncomfortable conversations, and they would be happening, and they would be conversations in which relationships would be preserved, not destroyed, and in which people would say what they're thinking. I think a school community where there's a lot of in which there's a lot of resilience, people would also apologize authentically, genuinely. They take responsibility for, they'd say, "Hey, I realized in our team meeting last week, I interrupted you, and I'm recognizing I think I do that a lot, and I'm committed to changing that, and I want to apologize for the impact that had on you." So you'd hear genuine apologies, people recognizing their areas for growth. Um, I think you'd see people having fun together and sharing aspects of their lives with each other. Not that everybody doesn't have to be best friends with each other, but I think you'd see a little bit more of authentic sharing about each other's lives.
Now, the only question we really need to get going here is, can we get you to open a school and can I work for you?
Oh, no, but I can help folks learn how to lead the kind of schools that they envision and that maybe, that share some similarities to what I'm describing. Because I think what I'm describing is what so many of us want. And so what I've written about and what I teach about in my trainings is, okay, what does this look like when we're in conversations with people? How do we set up the kind of teams where this happens? And that's what I love to do. I love to show people how you could teach people how you can do this, because it can be learned. And that's what I do in the workshops that I teach.
Great, great mention there of the workshops. I'm very excited to be joining you in Vancouver. And for any listeners that would also like to join, there will be a discount code BTEL200 if you would also like to join Elena and myself, as I will be eagerly taking notes and everything that will be happening in Vancouver this summer.
Oh, I'm so excited. That'll be great. Yeah, I'm so excited to. And then I'll also be in Toronto. And I'm just really excited to work with more Canadian educators. I have a lot of Canadians who come to my workshops in the US. And so finally I was like, okay, I'll come to Canada.
Thank you so much. A lot of educators that are very excited to come and learn from you. Elena, I would like to thank you so much for joining us today, for the wisdom that you shared. And to our listeners, thank you for being here, for the work that you do, and for continuing to examine what it means to support both ourselves and one another in education. Until next time, this is Behind the Educator's Lens.